Hello everyone and welcome to class 7 of the Effects PhD Houdini 204 Pyro Effects course. I'm Jonathan Gilbert, and in this video we're going to actually start exploring rendering and how to light, shade, and render your actual pyro effects. So right now in this scene, I've already gone ahead and simulated a very basic pyro simulation using the Flames tool and set up a light. Just put a spotlight up here just so we could actually see some shadows, and a camera so that we could actually render from a particular view. And I've also come in here and actually created a render node, a mantra wrap. So I'm going to actually create one of these from scratch really quick just to show you the quick setup, and then I'll reload this back up so you don't have to wait for the simulation to occur. So let me just save this really quick, create a new file, and basically I created a sphere. I just made it a bit smaller, set it to 0.5. Came up to the Pyro Effects tools and clicked the Flames tool. Once I was inside here, I changed the divisions up to 100 for now. And in the Pyro Solver, just changed a couple things, like added some vorticity and changed the cooling rate down to 0.1 so it cools off really quickly to help get a better looking fire. And let's see, anything else? Usually I'll put some animation in the turbulence, so just offset. So here's a T/2 in the turbulence, and as well in the source I'll just put a bit of animation in the offset of the noise and increase the turbulence of the noise as well. So those are actually everything that was changed in the simulation. And you'll notice if I press play, it'll take a little while to cook now because a 100 resolution is a little bit slower. But you see, it's cranking along. And so the important part that I wanted to show you was this. In your low-res pyro, you can jump inside here. You have this DOP.io node. And this is very important, especially when it comes to rendering. First off, when, say, for example, we were just simulating this out, and then we set up our camera and our light, and then we started to actually click render, our computer resources are actually being used up by the simulation itself and not completely devoted just for rendering. So we can actually greatly increase our performance of rendering by actually writing out this geometry to disk and then reading it back in directly and rendering just the written out disk from file. So all you need to do to get that set up is in this DOP.io, you would come to this geometry file, you'd open that up, and you'd go to wherever your hip location is. I can come in here, and let's go right here. Should be good. So we can actually jump in here, and you can set wherever you'd like it to be saved and what you'd like the name to be. So for example, I could set it up to be this, and actually I'd rather have the hip location. And since this file is untitled at the moment and not actually saved, that's why this isn't actually showing up here. But the hip location, the folder you'd like, and then this stands for $OS, which is the operator string, so it'd be called pyrofields $_f.bgeo. And then all you need to do is go to this export to file, set your start and end frame range, and then click render. And it will actually write all of those frames out to disk. And therefore, if your computer crashed or something happened, you would actually at least have this geometry still saved and you could actually still render. This isn't the same as actually writing out .sim data, which you would do inside of your Autodop network, for example. But this is still something you'd want to do when it actually comes to the rendering stage. So after that has actually finished up, you can then read in the file from disk by clicking this load from disk. And mine's erroring out because this is not a HIP location. And so from this point, I'm actually just going to load in my file and I'll be right back. Okay, so with the file open, I've actually gone through and upres this as well. We'll be covering upres in a future video. But all we've done here is, as you can see, here's the HIP file location, and it's loading it from disk, and that's actually pulling in this, and you can actually see the simulation is right here. And I can actually just jump through here, and this is all being read directly from disk. And so that's going to greatly enhance our performance for our render. I then jumped in and actually did this upres, which is pretty simple to set up, but it's not necessarily important for this particular video. It just is increasing the detail, and it's going to give us a little something more interesting to be rendering while we're working through this video. So we'll cover how to actually do upres, like I said, in a future video. So anyways, we have the same exact simulation. It's just been upresed, and actually inside here, the same exact thing has occurred where I've written it out to disk and I'm loading it right back in. So even with this upres, you can see we can just scroll along here and read it right back in. Okay. And so we have a spotlight. Something important when you're rendering volumes is when you're doing your lighting, you should set your shadow type to depth map shadows. By default, it comes in as ray traced, and this will possibly never let your render actually finish because ray tracing volumetrics in Houdini 11 is terribly slow. So set this to depth map shadows, and then a good rule of thumb is to come down here to this pixel samples and increase it from 1 by 1 to 2 by 2. And that will just get rid of some little grid artifacts you tend to get when you have low pixel samples for your shadow maps. So that will tend to take care of that. And so the next thing that leaves us with is our actual mantra wrap. Now you can create this in a couple different ways, and once again, if you haven't done much rendering in Houdini, I would suggest probably going through some basics of rendering. You could find some tutorials on the Side Effects website, for example, but just to get a basic understanding, because I'm not going to go into all of the details of how to actually render. I'm just going to point out some of the specifics for when you're rendering volumes. Okay, so you create your mantra wrap, which you can do by using the tab menu, typing mantra, and lay down a mantra wrap. We'll just use the one that I've already created, so we can delete this. And you'll notice up here you have your start and end frame range. So if you're rendering a sequence out, you would set this to 1 to 60 in this particular example, for example. And we're just going to render a single frame, so we're just actually just going to leave it. Now, the important thing is to make sure that in this main tab, your camera is set to the camera that you're going to be rendering from. Our camera is called Cam 1, and therefore this says Cam 1, and we're good to go. Now, the next thing to pay attention to is over here, which is you have your output tab, which is in your properties tab. This is the output picture. Right now it's set to IP, which is going to actually pop open our InPlay viewer and render it to that. Now that's fine sometimes when you're doing tests, but generally you're going to want to actually specify a location on disk and a file type. So for example, we can open this up and go to, say, our renders folder and call this something like Hu204 class 7. And then, so something like that would work. And generally, I like to keep things with the hip variable. So could put this like that. And that brings us to our renders folder. Okay. So our images that are rendered out will be called Who204 class 07 underscore the frame with 4 padding and then .tiff. Okay. So that's important to set up. And then down here, you have a couple options for you could override your camera resolution. So right now I'm just using a very small resolution camera, default 640 by 480. But sometimes, especially in production, you'll have HD cams and it might just take forever to try to kick out a render. So you can always click this override camera resolution and do something like half resolution or quarter resolution, and that will just greatly increase your performance for how fast your render is. And then when you're done, of course, you could just uncheck this and you're good to go. Now, over here is our render tab of our properties tab. And this has our rendering engine set to micro polygon rendering. That's what we're going to want to be using as of now in Houdini 11. We have other options, but when it comes to volumetrics, micropolygon is the best for us to be using. Ray tracing would take quite a while, and physically based rendering might not ever even finish. Now, tile size we'll take a look at in a moment. And let's just set that down to 16. And let's actually just kick off a quick render. So to kick off a render, we actually come down here to this little icon, this little film icon. And if you click and hold, if we can get it to show, I keep showing this little white, you'll notice we have view mantra, view renderman, and mantra 1. And pay attention to the size of these little squares that are being created right now. So we're getting these little squares, and those little squares that we're actually opening and then rendering that particular area, the size of those squares is determined at this tile size. So a tile size of 16 is the size of the tile within this render view. And the more, or basically the larger this tile size, the more information we store into memory about all the surrounding geometry for the pixels that are being rendered within that tile. So you can think of it like this. If we have, say, 32 here, our tile size is going to be bigger. And so at each time while it's rendering, it will make a larger size tile. More information about the scene is being stored within that, and therefore more memory is being used. However, because we have more information at our disposal during that particular time, we might be able to actually save time in rendering. So it's a trade-off for how fast our render completes for more memory. So if you have a lot more memory, you can actually increase this. However, it's worth noting that sometimes if your render fails or it doesn't complete, it could be because you're out of memory and this tile size happens to be too large. So just keep that in mind. So it's something worth playing around with and seeing which setting will work good for you. So 32 works perfectly fine for this computer in this particular simulation. Once again, if you have much more detailed information in your scene, a tile size that once worked for something a little bit simpler may no longer work for your particular situation. So you notice, by default, we get a fairly quick render. It's not too bad, and it looks fairly decent. Okay? Now, more settings to look at inside of our actual mantra wrap. We can allow motion blur, and if we do this right now, let's just take a quick look. You notice it takes a little bit longer. So generally, you can see there's a little bit of a difference now. It's moved a little bit. But generally, I'll hold off on rendering motion blur until the end, just to save performance times. Because once again, this is a very small render, but if you're rendering HD and above 2K and super high resolution simulations, it can really slow down your render times. So it might be good to do a test frame with motion blur and then render the rest without motion blur. And then once you get your simulation and the shading looking good, then you just turn on motion blur and add that at the end. But you want to make sure, and this is turned on by default by the shelf tools, that on your actual object, so in this example, the UpRes Pyro, you want to make sure that in the render tab, sampling tab, geometry velocity blur is turned on. And also, inside of your actual mantra wrap, that allow motion blur is turned on. But we're going to turn that off for now. So that leaves us with a couple more things. Pixel samples. Now, in terms of rendering volumetrics, pixel samples will give you better anti-aliasing, is pretty much what it'll help. And it will give you more accurate motion blur. All right, so by increasing that, it will take longer to render. And let's just give you an example. If we put it up to 6x6, you should notice that this does start to take, in fact, a little bit longer to render. But it should help motion blur and anti-aliasing of our edges. So that's pixel samples. However, there's something way more important when it comes to rendering volumes inside of the mantra wrap. And that's actually this right here, this volume step size. And we'll talk about that in one moment. Let's just let this finish rendering. All right. And at this level, there's really not too much of a difference. Okay, so let's just turn this back down. Oops, put it to 3x3. There we go. All right, so volume step size. What is this? Well, let's just move this aside for a second. When you're looking through your camera, so we're looking through our camera, the way, in a simple way of putting this, the way that the rendering works for this volume is a ray, and you can think of this as like an arrow that shoots from the camera directly into your scene. So you can see this rendered image right here. At this pixel, an arrow is shot directly in that direction into the scene. And as it travels and it hits something, the shader is run, and that can cause lighting information to start being calculated, shadows, the color, intensity, all these different things begin to calculate for the purposes of getting back a final pixel value that you see here. Now, let's take a quick sidestep and imagine this isn't smoke. It's not a volume. Imagine this was just a piece of geometry like a rectangle and made out of a surface. So this is a surface. It's no longer this smoky volume anymore. We just have a box. Like we lay down a box, we apply a shader to it, a surface shader, basic surface shader. We would shoot our ray into the scene. The ray would hit that rectangular surface. It would then run the shader. The shader would calculate the lighting and the shadows, and it would return a value for our pixel on our screen, and that would be done. If there was some opacity, it would continue to travel through it a bit and accumulate the values and then output that final pixel value. However, volumes are much more intense. So when we shoot the ray through the camera, from the camera into our scene, it hits the volume, and then it uses this volume step size to continuously travel at small intervals, which are defined by this actual step size right here, through the volume. And so as soon as the ray hits this volume, it looks up, it runs the shader, it calculates the lighting and the shadows, and it comes up with an intensity value, a color value, all of this information. And then it takes another step and goes a little bit further through the volume, and it runs it again, and it does this again. And then it starts to accumulate all this information, and it continuously keeps going until it's come completely out through the back of the volume. It then calculates all of those values together, and it finally gives us that final pixel value on the screen. So as you can see, volumes take a bit more time because it has to travel through the volume and accumulate the data to get that final pixel value. This volume step size actually is responsible for the size of the steps that go through it. So you can imagine, just the same way as we have a low resolution pyro simulation, for example, with larger voxels, we have a much less accurate looking simulation generally. If you say make this volume step size too large, well, the same type of thing happens. We end up with a less accurate representation of our final pixel value for our volume because we took larger step sizes, and that means we skipped a bunch of information that was in between those steps. And because we didn't factor that in, the value of our pixel color is going to be less accurate. But if we make this smaller, we're refining the size of those steps, and therefore we're gathering more information about our volume, and therefore our final pixel value will be much more accurate. So sometimes you'll notice if you do a render of volumes, it's not very accurate looking. It might look blurry. So you might have to lower this volume step size to a value that will actually pick up those details and actually return a value that looks better for your pixel value. So a good question that usually comes up is, well, how do you know a good value to choose for this volume step size? Well, there's a good rule of thumb, and if we jump to our object and we go into our AutoDOP network, let's jump inside here, and let's actually turn off. We don't want to calculate any dynamics right now. The rule of thumb is this. Here's your uniform divisions, and you look at the size and your dimensions. So you'll notice it's 3.5 by 6.5 by 3.5. What you want to do is this. Open up a calculator, unless you want to do it in your head, and take the largest axis dimension. So in this case, it would be 6.5. And you type in 6.5. And then you divide that by your uniform divisions. So in this case, that's not too hard of math, but it would be 0.065. That would be a generally okay value to use for our volume step size, because it actually will equal about the same amount of the size of our actual voxels. All right. But yeah, sometimes when you don't have uniform divisions of such a nice number like 100, the math might be a little bit tougher, so you might want to pull out a calculator. All right, so in our case, it's not going to hurt us too badly sticking with the default of 0.1. We could drop it down a bit, and actually let's just do that and take a look at about how much longer it takes to render. So now, if we jump back over here, we click render, take a couple of seconds for it to kick in. And there it goes. So notice the size of these squares once again. These are those tiles I'm talking about earlier. Each of these squares, like this little square right here, alright, so that didn't really take too long, and let's see if we see much difference in the actual render. You can see right around here, watch this area. There is a bit of difference in the information that we're seeing. And some of the shadows are looking a bit nicer and things of that nature. So it does actually matter. And so just stick with that rule of thumb and that should help. All right, so let's just turn this back. All right, so that gives you a good idea about this. For now, we'll just stick with 0.1, which will make it a bit quicker in terms of this demo. And let's actually jump to the main part of this topic, which is going to be the Pyro shader. Now, there are other shaders. If we jump to this material tablet, and let's get that to show up, you'll notice in the material palette, we have this gallery. And if we scroll down, here are some volumetric shaders. These are all totally valid to use, but we're just going to stick with the Pyro shader because it is more complex and a bit tougher to actually understand. If we take a look at these shaders, for example, this is the basic flame, has a low and high value, gives you a ramp for the coloring, for the alpha, the density, shadow, and an emission for some glowing effect. So as you can see, that's not too many parameters to have to deal with, where you can generally look that up and get the hang of it. But the Pyro shader is quite a bit different. Here's the Pyro shader, and let's actually make this a bit bigger so it's easier to see. When you first jump into the Pyro shader, it can be a bit intimidating. You see it's broken up into 5 tabs: smoke, fire, scattering, modifiers, and settings. Okay, so as we travel through here, there's tabs within subtabs, tons of different ramps, lots and lots of parameters. And so to make this as painless as possible, I'm going to do pretty much what I did when it came to exploring the Pyro solver and the basics of understanding how to simulate a Pyro effect, and that is to simplify greatly. By default, a lot of things are automatically set up for you, and that can make it really hard to actually know what is going on. Because as you can see right here, there are all these different modifiers, and we'll talk about what a modifier is in a moment. There's all these different noises, so there's a lot of things happening on here that can make this quite tough to actually understand and really make it harder to learn. So let's start off by actually creating a Pyro shader. And this is a default one. And this has nothing turned on inside of here. Okay? It just has a basic smoke visibility and density. All right? And we're going to work with this first, and then we'll come back to this at the very end of the video just to see how we can change this a bit. All right? And what we're also going to do is very briefly work on we're going to work on a very simple example first, and then we'll jump back to this. So let's actually turn off the visibility, and let's create a geometry object. And we'll call this fields. And just trust me for the moment, you'll understand why we're doing this in a second. So let's actually create, say, a rectangle. And we'll do that by laying down a volume. Scalar is fine. We'll make this, say, 50 sampling. And then let's use a volume mix. Now, some of these volume tools we may cover in more detail later, but just bear with me for now. I'm just simply going to be creating a volume, and that's it. But these tools are very powerful, the volume tools, and if we do have time, we'll cover these in a future video near the end. Okay, but for now, let's just get on with this video. So the bounding box of an object can be defined with this variable bb, x, y, and z. So the bounding box y actually stands for the y dimension of the bounding box. So the highest point of an object has a value of 1 for bby, and the lowest point in that object has a value of 0 for bby. So by doing what we're doing right here, let's actually make this a bit larger, say 8 or say 5 should be fine. And let's make it 5 and 2. Let's make it a bit thicker. All right, so what's really going on right here? Let me explain. So just created an empty volume right here with a size of 252, 50 uniform divisions. Then we've used a volume mix node where we've set the mix method to user, and we're defining explicitly the value of this volume, and I'm setting it to $BBY. So the values up here are going to be 1, the values down here are going to be 0. So now we have a volume that actually goes from 1 to 0. Okay? And if we ever really want to check what our min and max values are, which can be very worthwhile sometimes when you're doing shading in Pyro, here's a way we can do this. So we can lay down a null, and let's actually edit the parameter interface, and let's create 3 floats. We'll call the first one prim. We'll call the second one min. We'll call the third one max. Apply accept. Okay. And if we come up and open, if we go up to Window, HScript text port, and we get a text port, and you type xhelp, you get a list of all of the different expressions that are available to us inside of Houdini. If we type xhelp volume min, this is an expression that looks for a string surface node and a float prim ID. And it says it returns the minimum value of all voxels in a volume. That's exactly what we're wanting to do. The reason we want to do this is because when you're working with the Pyro shader, it's a really good idea to know what value range your field data is in. And because this will affect the way that the volume gets shaded based off the Pyro shader. Sometimes it expects particular values, and if you've tweaked a lot of things inside of your simulation, it could have changed your field values, and therefore the shader won't reflect something that you would think it should reflect. And by understanding this concept we're about to go through right now, it will really help you to actually understand what values you're actually working with. So here gives you an example, volume min, here's the path to this ISO offset, it's just an example. And then it's saying primitive ID 0. And there's also one called volume max. We're going to use both of these. And to make the process a bit easier, we're going to lay down a null. Call this out. And then we're going to type in here, volume min, and then we'll point to the out node. And then we set up this prim right here so that we could actually use a slider in case we have different primitives. And in this case, we only have one, but this will make it a little bit easier to use if we had, say, our fireball simulation or our flames, which has a lot of fields. We could actually run through the different field data just with this slider. So to actually get access to that, we'll use the channel operator and actually point to prim, which is what we've named this. If we hover over it, you'll see parameter prim. Okay. Now we can copy and paste this into our max and change this to max. And you'll notice we get something very close to 0 and 1. And the fall off generally is due to the fact that this is kind of lower resolution. So if we increase this, it should start to approach even closer, as you can see it has. And what we can actually even do to further make this better is use a volume ramp. And once again, don't worry too much about what all these nodes do, but generally this volume ramp allows you to remap volume data, which can be very helpful when you're actually trying to edit, say, a simulation and the field data wasn't exactly what you wanted. And once again, we might take a look at this near the end of this course, but for now, we're just going to use it to remap these values that are going from 0.005, 0.995 to actually 0 and 1, just to make sure we're perfectly clear. So 0.005 is the source min, and 0.995 is the source max. And as you can see, they've switched to 0, 1, and that's because we said the source min is this, the source max is this, and we're remapping it to 0 and 1. And so now what we have is a rectangular volume that has values that go from 1 at the top to 0 at the bottom, and you can see how they fade off gently over time. And we even have control right here, so we could actually fade it. See how we can fade this up? So we're actually remapping those values where we're saying right here it just says a value of 0 is a value of 0, and a value of 1 is a value of 1. If we do this, now we're saying values of 0 are actually values of 1, and everything else is a value of 1. So now every single thing in this, every voxel is now a value of 1. And you can see that is correct here, min and max, both values of 1. But we want to stick with what we had. We want values of 0 down at the bottom and values of 1 at the top. And the reason we want this is because we're going to apply some little effects with the Pyro shader to different areas of different valued field data. And this will just make it much easier. When you have a complicated flames or fireball simulation like this, for example, if we apply, say, noise to a particular value of density, you might not even know what's going on, especially when you're first trying to learn the Pyro shader. Say we said, hey, we want to add noise to areas that have a temperature of 0 to 0.3, and you set this up and you see a result, and it pretty much is hard to tell what's actually going on. But by doing something as simple as this, we can actually see exactly what's going on. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so now let's give this a name, and you'll notice right now, if we middle click, and we might have to jump up here, if we middle click, you'll see it says volume resolution. Primitive is 0, but it has no name. Well, let's just give it the name density. And so right now, if we middle click, and actually let's do this one more time, you'll now see it says 0 density. So now we actually have a field of data called density. It goes from values of 0 to 1, and that's right here. So we've just created our own field, essentially. And now we're going to actually shade this field. So let's actually go to the material palette. And let's click this Pyro 1 shader that we randomly created earlier. And we'll jump outside. And now we have our Pyro shader that has nothing set up on it. It just has the very defaults. And let's click render and see what we get. So let's take a look through our camera. and click render. And as you might expect, it's a very thick, dense smoke. You can see it slightly falls off down here. But that brings up a point about the first tab of the Pyro shader, and that is smoke. So right now we're not working with any kind of fire, anything else. We're working with smoke. And by default, the way this works is this. If we turn on smoke visibility, which is turned on, it allows us to actually render smoke. It uses this density field. It doesn't have to be density. It can be whatever field you want. That's a scalar field. But by default, it's set to density. So what the Pyro shader does is it looks on the geometry for a field named density. And if it finds it, it uses that as this density field. However, we have other options in this pull down menu. We have temperature, heat, burn, a lot of these different fields that you might want to use to render as your smoke. But since we created our own volume and our own field and it only has density, then if we try something else that doesn't exist, then this is what we get. And as you're probably already jumping ahead and thinking, you would get nothing because we don't have a temperature field, therefore we have no information and it's rendering as black, as expected. So now let's put this back to density. And this density amplitude is a multiplier of the amplitude of our actual field data. So we have values of 0 to 1, and we're multiplying it by 50. And that's why we're getting such a dense, thick smoke like that. So let's set this down to 1. Press render. And as you can see, it's fading off a bit down here and it's thicker up top. We might even be able to make this more apparent if we make it even less. Alright, so you can see it's slowly, it fades, and that's as expected. We have values of 0 down here, they're fading up to 1. Now, we'll put that at 1 for now. And you'll see to the side of many of these parameters, we have these things that say no mods, no mods. This allows you to pick modifiers that will modify the behavior of the particular parameter. So, in general, we could do something like add noise, and we can apply noise to the density field, or we can apply some noise, for example, to the amplitude. Many options. We'll go through modifiers in a moment, but let's look at some of the rest of the smoke parameters. So down here, you have smoke color, and as expected, we could change this to say red. Click render. And actually, while we're at this, we'll do something a little bit quicker. We'll jump into this render view and set this to cam 1 and click render. And it's generating a depth map, and keep that in mind, and I'll make a note why in a minute. But now we have an interactive previewer, which will make this much easier. So now we can actually be like, we have this kind of bluish smoke, and you can see it just changes in our viewport. But as I mentioned earlier, be careful about the generating depth map. If we did something that modified the actual density, for example, so say we added some noise and it really chewed up this density, our shadow map would no longer be truly valid, so we need to regenerate it. And by default, this doesn't regenerate your depth map, so we would need to hand click this render tool right here. And that's just something to keep in mind. Right now, everything's fine. So we'll just set this back to white, turn that down. And you can make modifications once again to the hue and saturation. So you could create some noise and apply it to the hue and get different colors. This is the brightness. So as expected, if we lower this, we'll get a much darker looking smoke to the point where you can hardly see it. There we go. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Shadow color is what it sounds like. It's the color of the shadow. So we do something wild and put a blue shadow. And there you go. But as you can see, rendered that shadow map again. Okay. But we'll just set that back to white. And this is the perfect example. You'll notice that shadow has not changed. And that's because we need to re-render and regenerate that depth map. Okay. Shadow density, that just changes how dense the shadow is, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then scattering phase. Scattering phase, it's a little bit tough to maybe see in this example, but what it actually does is if you have certain types of volumetric fluids, for example, will scatter light in different directions. So you could have forward scattering, so light that hits it actually scatters forward. And sometimes you have it where light scatters back, so you have back scattering. And sometimes you have equal scattering in all directions, which would be isotropic, which would be set to 0, 0, 0. But we can say increase this and have it so that light scatters forward. Or you can have negative, where light scatters backwards. And once again, this rectangular example, it's a little bit tough to actually see that. But you can read more about that in the help documentation if you're interested in getting and playing with that. And once again, you can add modifiers to these. And then finally, you have a post color correction. And so, for example, we could say tint it. And it's pretty much as simple as that. You can adjust the contrast, gamma, the tint, and the hue, saturation, and value. All right, so that's pretty easy. And it should be much easier also now with this simple example. So next, let's actually take a look at a modifier. So we can come over here to this modifiers tab, and you'll notice it's broken up into field 1 through field 6, and then noise 1 through noise 4. Let's click activate field modifier, and let's give it a name, and we'll call this my density. Let's just pause this for now. Now, my density is going to be a field modifier that we are creating that we'll be able to make access to in one of these pull downs. So what it allows you to do is pretty much what you saw in the volume ramp tools almost, where we can remap data. So right now, all we have is our density field. That's the only field we have. We created this rectangular density field. So that's the only information we have. But when we have bigger simulations and we're working with the Fireball, we have other fields that we might want to work with. So it provides us a menu that has access to those. Temperature, heat, burn, whatever works well for you. Well, we can remap this. So right now we have values that go from 1 to 0. And just like we saw with that volume ramp that we did earlier, we can actually, at render time through the shader, remap values as well, which is really cool. So, for example, let's turn this back on. And let's actually do what we did earlier and pull up this 0 mark up to here or something. So, as you remember, when we used the volume ramp tool, we just pretty much created a knot here, pulled it down. So let's do that. And generally, I've noticed it's a little bit slow right now because the recording and this interactive previewer and this. But let's re-render this. And you'll notice nothing's changed. And the reason for this, let's pause this, is because we haven't actually used it. So right now we could actually, instead of even using density, we could actually just use my density, which is this new density that we created. And let's re-render. And as expected, we've now pulled up that 0 mark because we've remapped it right here. And so once again, we've taken our density field, we've called it my density, we've remapped its values using this ramp, and then we are now using that modifier instead as our density field to render as smoke. And it's as simple as that. Okay? And of course, you can come through here and tweak values, make it less. So now we have values that go from 0 to 0.481. Anything of that nature, we can boost the values. So we crank up the data. Now it's quite bright. And soft clip and contour have to do with, they pretty much suppress the high values and the low values. And with this rectangular example, it's not very prominent, so you can just check that out in the help documentation. They have a very good visual for it, and make it much easier to actually see. So in this particular example, however, we've just remapped it, and now everything's fine. But let's actually do something a little more interesting and add some noise. So let's set this back. So now we have exactly what's coming in 0 to 1 as what's coming out 0 to 1, and it's going from 0 to 1 here. So right now we're not even doing anything to our density. The same values are here. So we could generally actually just use density instead of my density at this point, but we'll just keep it with my density. Click render just to get it back to our original rectangle. And now let's jump to the modifiers and let's create some noise. So we can come over to one of these noise tabs, click activate noise modifier, and let's call it density noise. And we'll just start with exist everywhere for now. Let's give it some higher frequency, say 6, and we'll give it an actual place to modify. So we're actually going to now modify our density field, this field right here, with the noise. So let's do that. Density noise. And you can see we actually have noise here. And remember, since we are doing this, we would want to recalculate the shadow map. But for now, we'll just leave it as is. We'll regenerate that in a moment. For now, let's just kind of take a look and prove that these details are changing. So let's turn down the frequency, and you should see that the details are larger now, so they're bigger. Whereas when we made them, they're much thinner, like smaller, tinier little details because they're higher frequency. And down here, we have output range. Right now, we're outputting a range of noise that goes from 0 to 1. And so we're essentially adding noise on top of our rectangle. But if we wanted to eat away from the rectangle, we could output values from -1 to 1, for example. And now we're actually modifying this density field with values from -1 to 1, which allows us to actually eat away at our volume. And let's actually just re-render. All right. So as you can see, we have now actually added noise to our volume. And let's increase the density and just see how that looks. All right, so we have a much denser smoke rectangle that has noise that's eating away at it. And this is one really powerful thing that you can do when you are actually rendering your pyro effects, is to add noise at render time to your actual render. Now, adding noise does increase the render time, so keep that in mind. And I've actually found that generally, if you can try to get nice noise introduced actually into the simulation itself, it generally looks better than trying to apply your own noise. But it is here, and it can add some nice little extra details. So it's definitely worth looking at how to do that. And so here you've seen how to actually apply noise everywhere. Well, let's take a look at how to actually apply it to a particular spot. So remember, we have a field called density, and that's the only field we have. We've created a modifier called myDensity, which is right here. Let's create something else. Let's, of course, we have to use density. And let's just call this one temperature, even though it's not. I mean, it is. We're calling it temperature. So we're now taking a field called density and going to remap it and call it temperature. And let's actually just leave these values the same. So it's pretty much pointless in this example, but just so you can see, we can do that. We can create fields from other fields in the shader, which is really powerful. But right now, we have this 0 to 1 range. And let's actually create noise. Where there's a temperature value from 0 to 0.3. So if you remember, we have values of 1 up top, values of 0 down here, and let's say values from 0 to 0.5 is what we're interested in. And this is a very powerful ability of the modifier tools, is to be able to use this active range of a particular field and apply noise only to that range. You'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. So right now, we're actually applying noise, and we're distributing this amplitude of the noise based on this active field range. We're saying that the low values are getting amplitudes of 0, but we don't really want that. We actually want the low values to get the highest amplitude noise, because we want more noise where the temperature is lower temperatures. So we're actually in this example saying at low temperature values from 0 to 0.5 temperature values, add noise. We want higher amplitude noise at the lower values, and then we want it to fall off and turn into low amplitude noise as it approaches these higher temperatures. And to do that, we would just reverse our ramp. And so now, let's re-render. All right. And let's stop this. Okay. So now if we go over here, and we have our density noise, an existing field, and we come over here to our smoke. All right, sorry about that. I just wanted to check something, and I've noticed that actually by trying to set this name to temperature right here and using it inside of our noise down here, we were still actually getting the noise applied everywhere. And so instead of doing this, let's actually just use our density field, and we'll go back and look at how we can fix this in a moment, but it didn't like that, and we can actually just use our density field, because once again, we were just creating our temperature field from the density field. Nothing was different about it. But here we're actually going to use our density field for our density noise. And we're going to say the values from 0 to 0.5. So just imagine this was temperature. And we're saying the values that are going from 0 to 0.5 are right here. We're giving high amplitude noise values down at the bottom. And we're filtering it off as it approaches this 0.5. So now if we do this, and we make sure density noise is turned on here, and we click render, this should in fact apply the noise only to the areas down here. And as you can see, it does. So you can see higher amplitude noise is applied at the bottom, and it falls off as it hits the 0.5 range, all the way to the point where no noise is even being added anymore. And let's stop that. And let's actually jump outside to our rectangle. And let's create something called temperature. And we're actually just going to use the same exact thing and just call it temperature. And then we're going to merge these two volumes together. And if we swap this and middle click, you'll notice, if it shows you, density and temperature. So we have two fields. They're actually the same, but we're going to take a look at how this would really act in terms of, in general, when you're using a simulation using the shelf tools. So if we go to our fields, go to our shader, now we actually have a temperature field that exists. And let's go over here and actually say density noise, it exists in temperature, and we're saying the values from 0 to 0.5 in the temperature field, and we should actually get the same result. And as you can see, we do. And so it picks up that temperature field, actually, that we've created. And if we make this go to 1, for example, we'll get a fall off of noise that goes all the way to this edge. And as you can see, it's going further and further, and it's slowly falling off at the very edge. So when you're doing this with a rectangle, it might not be the most exciting, but just think of it like this. When you're creating, say, a flames or fireball, and you might want to designate exact areas of your fields to apply noise. So for example, if you have a fireball and the colder smoke, as the smoke cools off and it begins to dissipate, you might want that to turn noisier. So as it's dissipating, it gets noisier and then finally disappears. That's usually a good place that you could stick some noise. And you can actually do that by using this exact method right here, where you can actually do exist in field, choose temperature, choose the low temperature ranges. So you could say, if you looked at your field data and you noticed that the temperature range from 0 to 1 or 0 to 2, and you just wanted the very low range of the temperature values, you could do 0 to 0.3, for example. Map the high amplitude down to here, add your noise in, and you would now actually be able to apply noise based on temperature to your density field. That's very, very powerful. We're actually regulating where we apply the noise based off of our temperature field and applying that to our density field. Pretty complex stuff, very easy to do, and once you've got that down, especially looking at this simple example, now you really understand how those values are driving where that noise is at. And we can come through here, and there's a lot of different noises, and in fact, let's take a quick look at, if you open up the Houdini documentation, there's actually in the Pyro shader, the noise modifiers, there's this really fantastic chart that shows your noise basis and your fractal type. And if we actually scoot this over, oh, unfortunately it pushes it off the screen. But you'll notice in the Pyro shader, in the noise modifiers, there's your noise basis and then your fractal type. And it shows you if we picked Perlin noise and then no fractal, this is the type of noise we would get. If we used a fractal on top of the Perlin noise, this is what we would get. And then these are the different types of fractals that we could apply to this Perlin noise. And then you can also go down this way and look at the different types of, say, alligator noise, inverted, applied with a multiplicative, and get something much more interesting like that. So this chart is very useful, and I'd highly recommend taking a look at it. So let's actually just try one of those interesting looks. Let's go for cellular inverted. And we'll invert the noise, and then we'll do something like multiplicative. And let's see what that gives us. So it should give us a different looking type of noise. As you can see, it's this stringier looking stuff, and for now let's just actually have it apply everywhere. So if we can go with that, and let's re-render. As you can see, we get this much different looking noise. And remember, right now we're using this range from -1 to 1, so we're eating it away. We could also just add it. Don't forget, we're modulating that actual density, so you'd want to actually regenerate your depth map. There we go. Now we're actually adding noise to our field. And so go through the help documentation, look at these different types of noise and fractals and the chart to see the type of noise you would get, and experiment. But the main point is this, is that you can use these noise modifiers and apply them to anything on here. Anything you want. We can modify the color with this. So let's just do that. And let's render. Let's give it some bit of a color. And you can see right there, we are actually modifying the hue with the noise. So you get these modifiers for pretty much all of your parameters, and you have a lot of control over that. So I'll just turn that off, press stop, set this back. So now you understand field modifiers, you understand noise modifiers, and let's now jump into actually putting on some fire. So let's just go over here and take a quick look at what the temperature field set to render as fire looks like. So we've turned off smoke, and this is strictly just our temperature field, which is our 1 to 0 field range. And that's what we get. The high values are obviously brighter, and they cool off. And we're getting these values based off of this color model down here. It has two options, physical and artistic. Now, this is based off of the coloring of the Kelvin temperature of a black body. And the way it computes this is it takes whatever value we have for our temperature value, it multiplies it by this number to get the Kelvin, and then it uses that black body to determine the color. So you can see if we change this, how that can affect it. All right. And just before we even jump more into that, obviously fire intensity is pretty easy. Higher values, crank up the intensity. Lower values, So it's pretty much like a dimmer. All right. And back down here to this physical model, red boost and blue boost actually just scoots up the values and pushes them towards blue. Happens to be the hotter areas of the spectrum, and red is the cooler areas of the spectrum. So this would actually push the values towards the hotter areas, and this would push them towards the cooler. Okay. And then we have artistic model. So we can come up here, set it to artistic. It instantly turns it to black and white, and that's because right now temperature to hue mapping is set to black and white. But we can change this, make it blue. So now we're actually getting our cooler temperatures are blue and our hotter temperatures are white. Set these to a different color just to prove. So now our hot temperatures are red and our cooler temperatures are blue. You can add as many little knots in here. So we could make this green. And now we've artistically defined the temperature. You can also remap the temperature to the intensity. So right now we just have the cool colors have an intensity of 0 and the hot temperatures have intensity of 1. We can make all intensities 1. And you can play around with that. And then eventually you could even color correct this, and it's the same as you've seen before. But we'll put this back to the physical model. And let's turn on smoke. And so as you can see, we have our fire showing through our smoke. And it's a little bit intense. It's actually, before we add that smoke, let's turn that back off. Let's create some noise for our fire. So we could come over here, create active noise modifier, create fire noise. You could allow it to live everywhere. Let's crank up the frequency, set it to, say, flow noise, set it to advection, boost up the roughness a bit. And set this to say 0.2 or 0.4 to 1. So we're not really eating away, we're just adding noise. And then let's come over here and actually add that noise. And as you can see, now we have a noisy fire. We can add our smoke back on top. And one thing to point out is down here we have this opacity field, and by default it's treating fire as having no opacity. But there may be times that you want to have opacity, and right now you're noticing the fire super blows out, and as the ray travels through it, it's accumulating more and more intensity as it goes through that volume, whereas we might not want that. So let's actually give it a general rule is to just use the same as your temperature field and your noise for your opacity. Let's re-render that. And we can actually have the fall off happen quicker by increasing this opacity amplitude. So as you can see, it starts to fall off faster. And we can make this say 40. And so we can use this to control how quickly that fire falls off in terms of its opacity fall off. Okay, so get something like that. Could lower this down a bit. Crank that up. And crank this up. So you can see you have a lot of control, and it even gives you this nice little, the way that it scatters the light a bit about it. But this is not the same as actually light scattering, which we have the option right here to do. So let's talk about that. So scattering light allows us to actually try to simulate the effect of light scattering from the fire through the smoke. And to do that, it generates point clouds. It creates a smoke and a fire point cloud. And it does this through a camera. So let's actually just set up a place to save this. So we'll put that here, and we'll put this one right here. And it has a smoke step size and a fire step size. And this is the step size that it's going to use as it steps through to create the point cloud. And just like most other things, if this is a larger value, you'll get a more coarse point cloud, and smaller values will give us a more dense point cloud. A good rule of thumb for these values is to do 10 times your actual volume step size that you're using in your Matarop. So we're using a 0.1, so a value of 1 would be just fine. You would then, if you're using animated sequence, set this frame range and set the frame range, and then click generate, and it would actually render out a point cloud, fire and smoke point cloud for each frame. And if you change something that alters the density of your smoke or the fire color, you would actually need to re-simulate or recreate these point clouds. So that's something to keep in mind. If you change something that affects the density or the fire color, you'll need to regenerate these. All right, so let's just create this one. And one very important thing to do before we do this is this camera. It looks through a camera and it creates the point cloud. However, if we had a camera that was, say, like this, really zoomed in, so the top and the bottom of this volume is not even being seen, and we generated our point cloud through this camera, we would get incorrect results when we rendered, because our point cloud would only be visible, it would only be created within that camera. So all of this out here and all of this out here would not have points in the point cloud, and therefore when it actually was calculating the light scattering, you would get very harsh cutoffs in the lighting because it's an incorrect point cloud that doesn't actually contain all of the information. So make sure that when you're creating a camera for scattering, that it totally encompasses your volume. And try to have it match your render cam as close as possible. But like I said, if your render cam is something like this, just make another camera, and it can be a totally different camera, different resolution, and just make it encompass this. But our camera works totally fine for our example right here. And so let's click generate. And when we do that, you will notice our point cloud is generated. So this is our point cloud. And now we can actually start to do some light scattering. And let's actually jump over to here and just do a quick render with scattering turned on. So let's actually jump to here, click render. Now, one thing to keep in mind, light scattering is much more computer intensive. It will end up increasing your render times, so keep that in mind. But we do have some controls that can help to alleviate it and make it not as long and not take too much time. Okay, so this is a pretty cool looking rectangle we have here. It's illuminating fire through this smoke. It looks a lot more fiery up here. It's progressing down to here where we have much thicker smoke and no fire. Okay, so what can we do? Amplitude is pretty much controlling the intensity. So if we say crank this up to 3 and we click render, as you'd probably expect, it's going to become brighter in the higher intensity areas. So it's basically a multiplier. So you can already see right there, it's turning brighter yellow. And more of the fire is eating up some of the smoke. So you can see that the fire is spreading throughout the smoke a bit more. Okay. So that one's fairly simple. Density attenuation and distance attenuation is pretty much an attenuation control for, it's been split in two. It could pretty much be in one if you wanted it, but they broke it up into two. Density attenuation is how abrupt, essentially, the scattered light attenuates based off of a dense volume. Distance attenuation is how fast the scattered light attenuates and falls off based off of distance traveled. Okay, so you have two different sections for this. If we crank this up, it will make our light fall off faster. And vice versa, if we lower these values, the light will not, it will travel further and not fall off as much. So we'll just kind of quickly run through there. You can see there is a change, and the light has become a bit dimmer because it's falling off and attenuating a bit more. And we had turned down this amplitude a bit. Okay, but let's escape that. Don't need to take too much time on this. Scattering phase is the same thing we talked about with scattering. Positive value will help it to scatter light forward. A value of 0 will be isotropic, which will have even light scattering, and a negative value will scatter backwards. Now, the important parameters, to be honest, is this max search radius and max contributors. Max search radius, it will take a point in the point cloud, and then it will search a radius set by this around that point. Any point that it finds in this radius will be used to contribute to the actual value of the scattered light. However, this could end up having thousands and thousands and even millions of points within that max search radius. So larger search radius can end up having even more points. So by limiting this search radius and making it smaller, you will make your render end up going faster usually, because the light isn't taking into so many points into consideration. However, it also has to do with how far the light will actually kind of bleed and scatter. So larger search radius tends to give light that scatters a bit further, and so it tends to look a little bit nicer. So larger search radius will take longer usually, but it will look pretty nice. We can use this max contributors to actually cut off and set a limit to how many points actually get considered. So even if in the search radius we had 10 billion points, we're saying only take 1,000 of these. Okay, and this is how many points to actually take into account for filtering and actually computing that final value. You have control over attenuation and shadows, hard shadows, and real. They progressively get more intense in terms of calculation time. So just generally keep that set to here. You can read about that more in the help documentation. And then you have a final color correction once again. So that's light scattering, and it does add a lot. It makes it look a lot nicer, and I would highly recommend playing around with that and using it. And let's move on finally to one last thing, and that has to do with this dual rest and this reset rate. And that will actually take us right back to our original topic, where we're going to get ready to round this up, and we're going to look at the fireball now. Now that we have a good understanding of how to set up smoke and fire, change the colors and the brightness and the density, and add noise and modifiers, light scattering, we can now actually go back to this volume and have a better understanding of what those parameters are actually doing. So let's go back to there. Go to object, turn off this field, turn on our upres. And jump to our Flames Pyro. And let's kick off a quick render just to see where we are. So already right away, you should just have a better appreciation for what these parameters are, so we don't need to really run through all of them again. But we'll just take a look at how a couple of these things can affect this before we wrap it up. And you can take the time to go through and experiment and test what you learned on your simulations, because that's what's really important about this whole topic, is your simulations can create different values. And that's what made the Pyro shader a little bit tough for people when they first started looking at it. Was, first off, it was created and it had all kinds of things turned on, modifiers, and that made it complex to understand what was going on. But other than that, your simulation, your scene scale, the way that you control your simulation can cause your field values to be different. So for example, this fire field that this shader happens to be using, which is set here, is using heat. Well, maybe we had cranked up some values really high in our simulation and it's causing our heat values to be incredibly high, and that can cause our shader to not react the way that it was automatically set up for. So that's why it's a really good idea to understand what these values do, so you can actually accompany and accommodate those changes that you make in your simulation, because pretty much there is no all-around Pyro shader setting that just works for all simulations. That's unfortunate, but that's just the way it works. It's based off of your simulation, the field values that are in your particular setup, and you're going to have to know how to actually go through here and accommodate those values that are in your simulation. So anyways, just really quickly running through here. If we lowered, say our density, then obviously our smoke would get less dense. And once again, we're pretty much just wrapping it up here, but just showing how you can actually make some changes and alterations to the shader and how that's going to affect. So as you can already see, we now have a wispier smoke, and that allows our fire to come through a bit more. We could jump over here and create, say, our own noise. So we'll call this my density noise, and we'll base it off of temperature. So this is the exact example we were talking about with the rectangle, where we're actually going to use the temperature field. And if we just jump outside of here, well, actually, we're not going to actually jump outside, because we don't have to run through the whole simulation. I was going to go inside the Pyro simulation and actually show you the temperature field inside the AutoDOP network, but since we're reading this directly from disk, we're not going to go do that. So just, you can pretty much imagine what the temperature values are. Hotter temperatures are going to be down here, cooler temperatures are going to be up here. So we're going to make use of that and do exactly what we were talking about earlier and say that lower temperature values, so 0 to 0.3, so values of temperature that go from 0 to 0.3, we're going to have high amplitude noise, and it's going to fall off. We'll make it Perlin, for example, 7, -1 to 1. We'll jump back outside to smoke, and we'll turn on my density noise, and we'll give that a quick render. And so what you should already expect is we're going to get some chewed up, noisy looking smoke. But now it should make sense why that's working and how we've limited it based off of the temperature of our smoke, for example. So as you can already see, the lower temperature areas of our smoke have been eaten up with noise. And let's crank up our density. Maybe we could see it a bit better. Click render. And there you go. We're already getting some nice noise areas. And these are right there in those low temperature areas. But once again, this should make it much more obvious to you why it's kind of hard to show how this works on this example, because now you see that there's noise being applied, but I mean, that can be kind of hard for you to tell that this really is the temperature values of 0 to 0.3 area of our density field, of our temperature field. So that's why it's better to see it on that simple example. And now that you actually understand it, you can go through and try it yourself. So you might notice some of these little rings and artifacting. Let's see what we can do about that. So let's jump out here to our Autodot network. And we'll go to our out mantra node actually. And let's change this volume step size. So we're going to increase the render time right here. But let's see if maybe some of this gridding has to do with not having enough information because of our volume step size. And we'll take a look. Because sometimes what can happen is we're adding high density noise or high frequency noise, which is very small details. And if we're taking too large of a volume step size, we might miss those details and end up getting an artifact. So let's see if this helps at all. And remember, a volume step size of 0.01 will end up taking quite a bit longer because it's making much smaller steps as it goes through the volume. Let's take a look. It's still cranking out. And we'll leave that there for a moment while it's simulating, rendering. All right, still taking a while. I'm going to pause this a moment. Oh, well, actually, here it goes. So as you can see, it did take quite a bit longer for that to even kick in. And remember, this is being recorded and it's using up a lot of resources. So let's see what we get here. And already, actually, you can see how the detail is much nicer already just from using that smaller volume step size. You can see it looks a lot more crisp. And in fact, we've gotten rid of those weird stretchy artifacts that we're getting, because now we have enough resolution through our steps to be able to calculate a more accurate pixel for our volume. All right, so I'm just going to let that keep cranking out while we continue our discussion and get to one last important thing. Okay, let's jump over here. And that's this right here, reset rate and dual rest. So I'm actually going to pause this render because it's slowing down the rest of the computer. And all right. So let's talk about what this means and what it can mean for you in terms of getting artifacts sometimes. So basically, when you are rendering a volume, and such as your pyro effect, to be able to apply noise that will follow the volume as the smoke moves, for example, or your fire is moving, we set up a field called the rest field, and that acts pretty much like a texture coordinate for our field. And that's what enables us to be able to map noise on top of it and actually have the noise move correctly with our actual volume as it moves. Just like if you had a simple object, surface, and you applied noise to it and you wanted to deform that object over time, you would need some kind of rest coordinates so that the shader would be able to correctly interpolate the change in the texture coordinates. So the same thing kind of happens in our smoke and fire simulations, but it uses two rest fields, because what used to happen if we had just one rest field, as time would go on, say we map some noise onto the smoke, and as the smoke moved and changed and twirled around, the noise would actually move and then stretch and get thinner and stretch even more. And so you just start to see this super stretchy noise that goes all over the place. And that did not look good. We wanted small detail noise that stayed small detail noise, and it moved with the actual volume. Well, the way to get around this that Side Effects chose was to get a dual rest field situation. So they actually created two rest fields that were offset in time. And so imagine a rest field that captured what the simulation was at like frame 0, and then one that was at frame 20, and or say 50. And then every, say, 50 frames or so, it would actually reset. So we have two rest fields. They reset every 50 frames, but the two rest fields are offset in time. So what they would do then is think of a sine curve that would just kind of leapfrog through the two rest fields, and at the apex of one of the rest fields would actually be resetting, while the interpolation between the two rest fields was fully on the non-resetting rest field. And I know it sounds like a mouthfeel a lot, but that's the best way to explain it pretty much. Is you have, when one rest field happens to be resetting, the other rest field still has time before it resets because they're offset in time. And so the actual interpolation is full on in the non-resetting rest field. And therefore, we can leapfrog between the two different rest fields and allow them to actually reset without seeing a pop. So if this wasn't the case, and we just reset the rest field, you would notice the noise just all of a sudden pop when it changed. But since we're actually interpolating between two offset rest fields, we're able to actually bypass this popping. However, by default, this parameter right here, reset rate in the shader, happens to be different than what is in the Pyro solver, and that can actually cause a popping artifact in your render. So let's take a quick look at that and then wrap this up. So come out here. I'm actually going to turn off the brain because we don't want to actually simulate. It's already been simulated. But here in your Autodop network, in your Pyro solver, in the Advanced tab, in the Rest Field tab, you'll see something speed, which is 0.8, and this represents how fast the rest field moves relative to the motion of the fluid. So if it was set to 1, it would actually move the same as your fluid. That tended to actually stretch it quite a bit, quite fast, so they actually lowered it a bit, and that seemed to work pretty nicely. Now, this right here, reset every frames, is set to 50, and it's set to dual rest fields to calculate the dual rest fields. So every 50 frames, you're going to get the reset. But remember, we have two rest fields they're offset in time, so those actual resets are going to occur at different times for those different rest fields, and therefore we're going to be able to jump between the two different rest fields and therefore make it so you don't see the popping actually occur. You will not see the reset, because when one rest field is resetting, the other one is at its full potential and not resetting, and we're actually seeing that field at that moment in time, and then it continues to interpolate. So this value right here, however, needs to be the same value here in the settings tab of the Pyro shader. So you would need to set this to 50. And that way you will not get a popping artifact. Okay. Now, one last thing that we're going to check out is this output variable section. Now, we're not going to go into compositing. This video has already been quite a long one, and in fact, the Pyro shader could almost be a whole course in itself, and I'm trying to jam-pack it all into one video really quickly. So here's the last little piece, and that has to do with actually getting some different image planes rendered out at render time for no cost. And we can do that by going into your mantra wrap and jumping down to the bottom in the Properties tab, Output tab. If we go to the bottom, you'll notice extra image planes. We can just type 6. We're going to make 6 different planes. And now what we want, actually, just to remind myself so it doesn't take too long, let's change this volume step size again to say 0.05 so it doesn't take as long to render. Okay, so anyways, we have our extra image planes. We're making 6 of them. We're interested in these names right here. So in your Pyro shader, in the Settings tab, in the output variables, you'll see vector csmoke, cfire, cillume, and then float asmoke, afire, mfire. So what you will do is come out here and remember csmoke, cfire, cillume, and actually type csmoke, cfire, cillume. And now this is very important. These are vector variables, so this vector type is chosen. However, for these next 3, these are floats: asmoke, afire, mfire. Asmoke, float. Afire, afire, float, and mfire, float. Okay. And let's jump back here. Let's do a quick render. So these output variables will help you when it comes into compositing. And you'll notice right here, it tells you what they're responsible for. So you'll see csmoke is your final illuminated smoke color, cfire is your final fire color, cillume, and you can read all these. So this will help you. It tells you exactly what they're used for. But you'll notice the render was still pretty quick, but it created all these different passes for us. So there's csmoke, there's cfire, cillume, asmoke, afire, and mfire. So you can then take those different passes into compositing, and they're already broken out for you, and it took no extra time to do this. And that's all you need to do is add these in your actual output. So once again, go into here, into your properties, and you want to make sure that this output picture type is a format that can actually handle multiple image planes if you wanted to save it all into one file. So you could use, say, EXR can hold multiple channels. Or you could actually specify an individual file for each one. So you could break them out into individual files by setting this channel name to an actual explicit file path. So you could do that as well. Oops. Let's see here. All right. And just to show you, creating extra image planes is really easy. This is a little bit outside the scope of Pyro, but just to really quickly wrap this up, down here we just created a new one. There's a pull down menu over here, and it's cut off on our screen, unfortunately, but there's all these different types of common shader image planes that you might want to use for normal shading purposes. When you use a normal shader that happens to have direct diffuse, direct specular, reflection, indirect, all these different shadow types, position, alpha, opacity, color, all of these different image planes are set up for you inside of your shader generally, and you can usually get a hold of them here in this pull down menu. But the Pyro shader, they're not actually in this pull down, so that's why we had to actually take those in. And so that's how we can actually get extra image planes. We can composite it in our final compositor of our choice and have full control over our simulation's final render. So I hope you learned a lot in this lesson, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.